see this especially in the workplace, that a woman's communication is always being evaluated. So if you don't speak up confidently enough, you're considered meek or weak. And when you do speak up and you are vociferous in your advocacy of something, then you're considered shrill, emotional. And so to me, one of the worst parts of being a woman is just feeling like you're always being judged and evaluated on the level of your communication and the amount of emotion in it. And the minute you cross that line and become very firm in what you're trying to say, then people say, oh, she's very emotional. Well, I've talked a lot about work in this video, and I've talked about some of the things that I went through starting in my job in law enforcement in the 1990s. But there are women who started this in the 60s and the 70s. So I look at the women who went before me in this job and dealt with harder things than I have. I thought it was hard to try murder cases as a woman sometimes because of how a jury perceives you. But there are women who did it in the 70s and 80s, and they broke all kinds of barriers. And people like me who started in the 90s stood on their shoulders. So I'd mention names, but you're not going to know them. So I'm just going to say the women who went before me in law enforcement. So I should say I work in an office of over 250 people, and I'm the only woman on the executive staff. So I supervise half of the office, and what I supervise is the investigative unit. So that would be like homicide, narcotics, special victims unit, child abuse, white collar crime, domestic violence, and so forth. Being in a position of leadership and being the only woman in this position, working only with men in their 50s and 60s, places on me a tremendous burden to bring other women with me. Some of the hardships that I may have endured when I started on the job that made me tougher and stronger, I reject now. It is not my job to put women through that same thing. It's my job to get them to the position that I'm in, because I don't do my job well if I retire and I'm the only woman in this position again. I need to bring other women with me and open doors for them and make sure we're considering things like how their life choices affect their promotions at work, such as a woman having children and then coming back to work. And I have to constantly be sensitive to that. Now, I had a particularly rough day at work yesterday dealing with the executive staff in my office, so maybe this isn't a good day for me to be doing this, but in a very long and heated meeting, where I felt like maybe there had been a pre-meeting that I wasn't a part of, I just tried to keep my cool and not overreact to things and not make it personal and just keep my eye on the ball. And that's something that I always find myself doing and encouraging other women to do too.
I was a part of Student Speak last year, and I was encouraged by a teacher to speak out at board meetings about the rights I believe in and why it's so important to use our voice, especially as a minority. We don't really have our voice represented that much, so I built up the courage to read my college essay that talks about how being a woman of color, growing up in a less diverse community, has really affected me, and why it's so important to keep diversity and inclusion task force available. Growing up as a woman of color, it's hard for me to find role models who look like me. So at a young age, I would have to look towards my mom, who isn't a person of color. And I found a lot of confusion as to why I didn't see any role models who looked like me, and wondered like how I can make an impact and become a role model for younger girls. So I joined Student Speak, and we had junior high girls who were also people of color, and they would come up to me and tell me how much like they saw themselves in me and how much I've impacted them, to show that I am confident of who I am and why it is important to have your voice And yeah.
Um, a woman is in a STEM field. I've been pretty oblivious to like the whole idea that women shouldn't be in STEM fields. Like that's not something that I grew up understanding. You know, I was good at math and that was the path I took. And then I kind of got to the end of my undergraduate career and looked around and went, hey, where'd all the girls go? And so I feel like that oblivion was really good for me because I never really felt any sort of pressure to like shy away from things like math and science and stuff that I was kind of naturally good at. So, but I think it's really important to understand that now that I'm in education, because it's really good for girls to see other women in STEM fields and have that as a role model and, you know, things like that. So, but I can't say that I've suffered any sort of like overt sexism or anything like that. Just a lot of kind of being underestimated, you know. I'll get a lot of people who will ask me what I do for a living, and I'll say I'm a teacher, and they'll say, oh great, what grade do you teach? And I'll say high school, and then they're usually like, oh, not high school. Okay, what subject? And I'll say math, and they're like, you teach math? No way, you know, like most people think I'm like a second grade teacher. And so I think there's a little bit of that sort of societal, I don't know what you want to call it, just sort of stereotypes built in there. But it's what I do and I like it. So, professionally, and I don't know if you were here when Mrs. Rabb was here, but she was a teacher in our department, and at the time she was still teaching. She wasn't in administration yet, and I think she was a very big influence on sort of my formative years as a teacher. I think similarly, Mrs. Clement, who recently retired, was a really big influence on me professionally too, for exactly those reasons. They were women in this field, and they did what needed to be done, and they were able to be very steadfast and very confident in what they were doing, and that's something I think I could learn a lot from.